If you look around at the cultural landscape right now,
Yeah.
it's pretty hard to miss. True crime is absolutely everywhere.
Oh, completely. It has just saturated everything. We've gone from it being this kind of niche fascination to total cultural dominance.
It's not just a trend, is it? It feels like a genuine economic and cultural force at this point.
It really is. And it's funny, we think of this as a new thing, but it's built on a really deep-seated human fascination. The genre has been around for centuries in one form or another.
You mean like old pamphlets and things?
Exactly. In the 16th century, you had these crime pamphlets that were basically the tabloid media of their day, all shock and horror. Then in the 19th century, you had these hugely popular dramatic plays based on real murder cases. The public's appetite has always been there.
But the scale today is just,
Yeah,
it's fundamentally different.
massively different. Yeah.
And I think we can probably pinpoint the real catalyst for this modern renaissance, the Serial podcast, back in 2014.
Yeah.
That felt like the moment everything shifted.
It really did. It changed how we consume it. It went from something passive to this active, almost collaborative thing. Suddenly, everyone was an armchair detective.
And the whole industry just exploded. Streaming, books, social media, and of course, a million more podcasts.
The numbers are just astonishing when you look at them. I mean, some of the research we pulled suggests that 1 in 3 Americans consumes true crime media at least once a week.
1 in 3. That's not just a few dedicated fans.
No, that's a huge slice of the population, and they're powering this enormous multi-billion-dollar industry.
And that's where the problem is, isn't it? That scale, that economic engine. That's where the central ethical conflict lives.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive, to get into that tension between the psychological pull of it all, our craving for drama, wanting to understand the darker side of society.
And processing our own fears in a safe, controlled way.
Right. Versus the really severe ethical pushback, the exploitation, the re-traumatization, and just the outright sensationalism of real human suffering.
And we've got a huge stack of sources here to unpack it all. Everything from academic analyses and articles on things like the true crime influencer, all the way to these crucial guides from victim advocacy groups.
We're looking at guides from the National Center for Victims of Crime, the NCVC, and really all these sources, they're all asking the same fundamental question. Can this genre actually be entertainment without tipping over into exploitation? Is there a line between responsible reporting and sensational drama? And can that line even hold in our current, 24/7 content economy?
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Because the financial incentives, they're almost perfectly designed to reward the worst ethical choices.
Okay, so let's start with the most visible part of this whole debate. The big budget, glossy dramatizations that the streaming giants are churning out. This is the cost of commercialization.
This is where trauma becomes high-budget IP, intellectual property. When a real tragedy gets packaged into a sleek 10-episode limited series, the ethical accountability, it often just disappears.
Why is that?
Because profit becomes the main and sometimes only motive. And the distance between the people making the show and the people whose lives are being portrayed becomes absolutely vast.
And there's no better example of this Netflix effect, than the 2022 series, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story.
Yeah, yes.
The success of that show was just staggering. It wasn't just a hit. It passed 1 billion viewing hours. 1 billion! It's one of the most watched shows in Netflix history. That's a massive cultural footprint.
And that success immediately sparked this huge ethical backlash that for a moment became a national conversation because the money, all of it, flowed exclusively to the creators and to Netflix.
You have the co-creator, Ryan Murphy, who's already working under this reported $300 million deal with Netflix.
And Evan Peters, the actor who played Dahmer, he won a Golden Globe for it. So the awards and the money are just piling up.
And while all of that's happening in Hollywood, the people whose lives were actually destroyed by this man, they're, as one journalist put it, nowhere to be seen, off-screen, dealing with the fallout.
It's just a classic case of profiting off the backs of victims who were completely ignored in the process.
And this wasn't just a general, feeling of bad taste. The sources we looked at detail really specific, egregious harms.
The victims' families stated very clearly that they were never contacted about the production. Never. Even if the production company says they tried, the lack of any real consultation is just a profound ethical failure.
They were just forced to relive their absolute deepest trauma in this glossy, high-definition format that just landed on their TVs without any warning.
And it's not just that they weren't consulted, it's the active distortion of their trauma for dramatic effect. Reporters who covered the original crimes pointed out that so many details were altered or just exaggerated for the show.
And worse, the family's own original statements. Their most painful, private moments of testimony
Yeah.
were reportedly changed or just repurposed without their consent.
The most heartbreaking example of this was the portrayal of Rita Isbell. She's the sister of one of the victims, Errol Isbell.
I remember seeing this comparison online. It was chilling.
It was. Her incredibly emotional, powerful victim impact statement from the original trial was essentially reenacted, shot for shot, in the series. And she spoke out about it afterwards. She called the whole experience harsh and careless.
That moment was for her brother. It was about justice for him, and they turned it into a piece of entertainment for the whole world to consume.
Exactly. She said, the series brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then. And she made the point so clearly. She said, it's sad that they're just making money off of this tragedy.
She just wished that if the show had to be made, some of that profit could have gone to the victims in some real, meaningful way.
That feeling right there of being re-traumatized so someone else can get rich, that is the absolute core of the ethical breakdown.
Which brings us to this fundamental argument about consent. It's something that often gets dismissed when creators are dealing with, public figures or cases that were in the news.
The argument is always, well, we're just using public records.
Right. But practically speaking, is it ethical to dramatize someone's worst day without ever talking to the people who have to live with the consequences of that story being told?
The legal right to access a court document does not grant you moral permission to re-traumatize someone. That's the bottom line. When you fictionalize a real person's pain for profit, you are profiting from their identity.
It raises the question of whether people should have their stories twisted into fiction just because there's no legal duty to consult them.
And the sources show this goes way beyond the Dahmer case. You look at other big dramatizations like the ones about the Menendez brothers. Family members have been just as vocal. They criticize what they called vile and appalling character portrayals.
It seems like the pursuit of entertainment just demands a level of sensationalism that completely ignores the humanity of the real people.
And that sensationalism often leads to something even more insidious, which is the glorification of the killers themselves.
How does that happen?
It happens when the media tries to, get inside the killer's mind or show them as these ordinary people who just snapped. It subtly positions the audience to feel empathy, or at least some connection.
And that shifts the focus away from the victims.
Completely. It shifts attention to the spectacle of the perpetrator. And we've seen this lead to these grotesque, deeply concerning fan bases forming around killers.
Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, Chris Watts.
It's this disturbing trend where the focus moves from the crime to the killer's looks, their supposed charisma, this warped romantic thing.
And the Dahmer series just poured gasoline on that fire.
It absolutely did. By casting a very popular and, objectively attractive actor like Evan Peters, it was inevitable. You immediately got this flood of fan edits of the serial killer character on TikTok and Instagram.
Treating a mass murderer like a fictional heartthrob.
It's the normalization of the monstrous. And it's a direct toxic consequence of turning real horror into consumable entertainment.
And it just immortalizes these figures, doesn't it? Often at the expense of the victims' memories. It must make it so much harder for the families to move on, seeing the person who destroyed their lives being fetishized online.
And the obsession doesn't just stop with the media, it extends to tangible objects. The sources detail this really unsettling but enduring public fascination with serial killer artifacts. It's a real market.
Can you give us some examples? Because people might assume this is a super fringe thing, but it's more visible than you'd think.
It is. You can go to places like the Alcatraz East Crime Museum. They have Ted Bundy's dental cast on display, which was key evidence right next to his typewriter.
Wow.
They also have Jeffrey Dahmer's actual handcuffs and his signature on property receipts from prison. It just shows this constant disturbing demand for tangible pieces of this history. These aren't relics of justice, they're relics of murder.
And that demand can end up fueling the very people it's supposedly documenting. Dahmer, when he was in prison, he received, and I'm quoting here, an enormous amount of mail and money, mostly from females who never knew him.
It's fascinating, in a dark way. The same sensationalism that drove those cheap 16th century pamphlets is now just amplified by algorithms and the sheer scale of the digital economy.
Turning these horrific acts into these grotesque, profitable fandoms.
The mechanism is the same, it's just the distribution and the scale that have changed everything.
Okay, so let's shift from these huge streaming productions to the much more casual and democratized world of social media content. This is where the ethical lines really start to blur.
Or vanish entirely. Yeah.
This is where we see the commodification of suffering taken to its most bizarre, casual extreme. Platforms like TikTok and YouTube have created these content formats that just blend lifestyle narratives with graphic true crime stories.
And it's all about maximizing shock value and monetization. The algorithm just rewards the most shocking combination of things.
I mean, we're literally talking about people mixing true crime with things like makeup tutorials and mukbangs, where they eat enormous amounts of food.
Right. It sounds like a parody, which is maybe the heart of the problem. That bizarre clash of contexts is what really shows the ethical vacuum the algorithm creates.
It forces you to ask, what is an acceptable thing to listen to while you're putting on mascara or eating a giant bowl of noodles?
You have creators like Bailey Sarian, who built a massive brand with her murder, mystery, and makeup videos.
And the criticism is about her tone, right?
Yeah.
It's very casual, conversational. Like she's just chatting with a friend while she's discussing these horrific, graphic crimes, murder, sexual assault.
The juxtaposition is incredibly jarring, and it's the same with Stephanie Sue's Rotten Mango mukbang videos. They're hugely popular, but a lot of people find them deeply disrespectful for that exact reason.
Because the act of eating, especially in that quantity, is sort of celebratory. It's distracting. And that mood just clashes horribly with the somber reality of a violent crime.
And the core issue that ties all of this together is that these creators are making a full-time, very lucrative living from ad revenue and sponsorships. They are profiting directly from telling these stories of human tragedy.
They're incentivized to find the next most horrific story to tell.
And the ad read problem just highlights this conflict perfectly. We saw this example with the TikTok influencer, Michelle Cuervo. She has like 1.6 million followers.
And she posted a video about a really heartbreaking case. It was about a child who was physically and sexually abused by his father.
And she prefaced that incredibly tragic, sensitive video about the most vulnerable victim you can imagine with a sponsored ad for her brother-in-law's protein powder business.
The whiplash of going from child abuse to muscle supplements is just astounding.
The backlash was immediate. People flooded the comments saying it was beyond unethical to use that kind of tragedy to sell a product. It was clear proof that the creator just either didn't see the problem or didn't care.
But isn't this really a problem with the business model of YouTube and TikTok themselves? I mean, the platforms reward shock and velocity. To have a career, you need these constant, compelling, shocking titles and thumbnails.
That's a very fair point. They are, to a degree, playing the game, but it becomes the creator's responsibility to resist that algorithmic pull towards pure sensationalism.
And this need for clickbait often pushes them away from ethical reporting and towards visual distortion.
A great example is a typical Bailey Sarian YouTube thumbnail. You'll often see this glamorous, professionally shot photo of her perfect makeup, perfect lighting, right next to a prison photo of a perpetrator.
Or even worse, a photo of a young victim.
Yes. And then a provocative question in the title like, the baby snatcher, did she deserve it? Or a victim herself? It's all designed to maximize clicks.
It just reduces this incredibly complex human story, all the suffering, into a simple, clickable spectacle.
And the pressure to be compelling also leads to prioritizing drama over truth. Creators are always looking for the most creative way to tell a story, maybe by getting a new source or just telling a known story with more dramatic flair.
And what's the risk there when drama overtakes fact?
The risk is outright fabrication. The sources we read highlight that creators will often fabricate victims' thoughts and emotions during the ordeal based on their personal assumptions.
So they're just making it up, filling in the gap.
They're assuming what a child or an adult might have felt or done. And that is so profoundly insensitive to the memory of the dead and the experience of survivors. It can have real social and legal consequences if that misinformation spreads.
That blending of reality and entertainment is what leads to the next phase, isn't it? When the audience becomes an active participant. Let's talk about the double-edged sword of citizen sleuthing.
The amateur investigator is a huge and often very volatile part of the modern true crime world. We're talking about fans on Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, who are discussing theories and trying to solve cold cases.
On paper, that sounds amazing. A community effort to shed light on old mysteries, maybe bring closure to families. But the sources point to some really severe dangers when that enthusiasm isn't checked.
The harms are very real. On a personal level, it can be extremely harmful to the targeted individuals and their families. When the public becomes the judge and jury, speculation and misinformation can spread like wildfire, often targeting totally innocent people.
And what about the harm to the actual police investigation?
It can absolutely hinder it. Law enforcement has limited resources. When you have all these people interjecting, pushing strong but completely wrong theories, it can force police down unproductive paths, wasting precious time and money.
And then there's the direct emotional toll on the co-victims, the families and friends.
It's awful. They get subjected to what one study called trolling behaviors and strangers trauma dumping on them. They get harassed online, even in person, by these self-proclaimed sleuths who are demanding information.
The bottom line seems to be that a murder should never, ever become a fandom, where the audience feels they have a right to treat the tragedy like a puzzle.
Exactly. And the legal risk is huge, too, this concept of trial by media. When these true crime narratives blur reality, the public starts forming these really firm judgments about guilt or innocence based on incomplete, sensationalized info.
And that completely violates the core legal idea that you're innocent until proven guilty.
This trial by media can seriously interfere with a defendant's right to a fair trial. It can lead to wrongful convictions or defamation against innocent people. It has real-world legal consequences.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second, because you said earlier it can be corrective. If it's so legally risky, how do we explain the times that it has actually worked, when all this massive sensational attention actually did help achieve justice?
And that is the paradox, isn't it? It's a really difficult truth. The modern true crime genre has so much power because it does encourage participation, and that sustained public outcry can force systems that are stuck in inertia to actually move. The attention is the engine.
Okay, let's look at the most famous example, the one that kicked this whole podcast boom off, Serial.
Serial was this incredibly detailed re-examination of Adnan Syed's conviction. It brought all these major flaws in the original case: ineffective lawyers, questionable evidence, to a huge audience.
And that constant public pressure, that scrutiny.
It ultimately contributed to him being fully cleared of all charges in 2022. The podcast didn't solve the case, but it absolutely kept the system honest through relentless public pressure.
Then you have The Jinx, the HBO documentary on Robert Durst.
Yeah.
That wasn't just investigative, it led to a direct confession.
An accidental one. They confronted him with new evidence, and he went to the bathroom, not realizing his mic was still on, and just muttered to himself, "What the hell did I do?" Killed them all, of course.
That is media influencing a judicial outcome in the most direct way imaginable.
It is. And of course you have Making a Murderer, which led to massive public outcry and legal review for Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey.
So these cases really do show the genre's potential to be legally corrective, to expose systemic flaws, misconduct, bias.
They do. The huge question is how we can harness that power for justice without all the harmful, exploitative fallout of sensationalism and mob justice. The line between advocacy and interference is just razor thin.
Which brings us right into the legal arena. Let's look at the specific frameworks that govern, or more often, fail to govern this content, particularly around privacy.
When we talk about the legal gap, we're really talking about the tension between the First Amendment freedom of speech and the privacy and emotional safety of victims and their families.
And the reality in the U.S. is that the law provides very limited protection for victims who want to stop the media from telling their story.
Exactly. The law tends to focus very narrowly on defamation, proving something is false and intentionally harmful, rather than on privacy invasion or emotional distress, especially when the event is a matter of public record.
So because of the First Amendment, the laws often end up protecting the content creators over the victims.
Right. It allows them to recreate the worst moments of someone's life under the banner of news or entertainment. They can argue they're just using public records court documents, news reports. So if the information is public, what right does a victim have to complain?
Legally, their defense is strong.
But ethically, as we keep saying, that legal access does not absolve them of ethical responsibility. And that's the moral problem, especially when they move from just citing records to full-on dramatization.
Like the Rita Isbell victim impact statement in the Dahmer series, that's the perfect example of where legal and ethical responsibility just completely diverge.
It is.
So if victims don't have strong privacy protections, we need to look at other tools. Which brings us to this concept of the right of publicity. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. The right of publicity is basically the right you have to control the commercial use of your own identity, your name, your likeness, your persona. It's usually applied to celebrities. If someone uses a famous athlete's name to sell sneakers, they have a right to sue.
But the argument here is that victims and their families should have that same right when their story or their identity is used in a commercial true crime story.
The legal reasoning is really compelling, and it's rooted in fairness. I mean, think about
Sure.
it. Without the victims, the killers would have no notoriety. The victims are truly indispensable to the story.
They're the engine driving the commercial success of the whole thing.
Right, so if a story is being used primarily for commercial gain like selling a Netflix subscription, the victims should have some control over how their identity is being used.
It's basically saying their suffering has commercial value, and they should be the ones to control or profit from it, not a production company.
Exactly. When a show uses the real name, image, or likeness of a victim or a family member, they should have to get permission. The current system basically allows creators to deepen the wounds of people who have already suffered so much just so they can profit.
So, based on the research, what would a real framework for legal accountability look like? What are the shifts we need to see?
The sources point to a few key reforms. First and foremost, required consent from victims and their families before any dramatization or reenactment. This would be a mandated industry standard, not just a polite suggestion.
That's a very clear line in the sand. If you want to use this story for entertainment, you have to ask permission. You have to negotiate.
Second, we'd need to strengthen defamation laws and create specific, binding industry ethical guidelines. And third, and this is crucial, we need regulations that redirect a substantial portion of the profits from these shows toward victim support or justice reform.
That directly addresses the point Rita Isbell made, that if money has to be made, it should go back to helping those who were affected.
It creates a real mechanism for accountability, and this model isn't just theoretical. Ethical producers are already doing this.
Let's go back to Ryan Murphy, the same producer from the Dahmer series, but in a total different context. The production of Impeachment, American Crime Story.
Right. For that project, which was about the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Murphy insisted it would not go forward without her full involvement. She signed on as a producer.
Not just a consultant, a producer, giving her real creative control and a financial stake.
And her own words on it really highlight the importance of this. She said, "People have been co-opting and telling my part in the story for decades. It wasn't until the past few years that I've been able to fully reclaim my narrative."
That model, giving the subject control and ensuring they benefit, it seems like the gold standard.
It feels like the only path forward if the industry is going to be salvaged from pure exploitation. It moves the conversation from "we have a right to tell this story" to "we have a moral obligation to include the person whose story it is."
Precisely. And that lets us pivot to the other side of this. The areas where true crime actually does excel as a medium for advocacy and education. Because it's not all a moral swamp.
Not at all. There are places where it does genuine good.
We've definitely seen this shift toward models that really prioritize the survivor's experience. They focus on context and reform, not just sensationalism.
And the recent Netflix docuseries American Nightmare is a perfect example of this. It's about Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn.
The couple whose kidnapping in 2015 the police initially dismissed as a hoax.
A hoax inspired, in their minds, by the plot of the novel Gone Girl, which is just an unbelievable detail.
It is. And that series was produced with their full permission, told entirely from their point of view. The goal wasn't just entertainment. It was to rebut the police department's negligence and those awful public claims.
The public and the police let a work of fiction dictate their view of reality, and it re-victimized this couple. The documentary became their platform for restorative justice.
And it worked. It allowed them to share their unbelievably true story, expose the institutional failure, and it helped them secure a multi-million-dollar settlement. The media was corrective, not exploitative.
This is survivor-led media at its best. But this ethical approach isn't just limited to big documentaries. We see it with individual creators, too.
Like on YouTube.
Yeah. Some YouTubers, like Kendall Ray, use formal submission forms for families who actually request coverage of their loved one's case. She only tells their stories with explicit permission.
So the family controls the narrative's existence from the very beginning.
Exactly. And crucially, she often donates the profits from those videos to organizations fighting human trafficking, like Thorn.
So the financial gain doesn't have to be purely exploitative if it's channeled back into advocacy and done with consent.
Right. And beyond these specific cases, the genre also serves this powerful therapeutic and educational purpose, especially for its largely female audience.
Scholars argue that a lot of women are drawn to it because it helps them document victimhood under patriarchy. It's a space to process collective fear and learn the patterns of dangerous behavior, like a cautionary survival guide.
And it's not just about past tragedies. Survivors sometimes tell their stories to offer really practical tips for navigating horrifying situations, how to recognize coercive control, specific survival techniques.
We see this powerful shift in focus in memoirs, too, like the one by Luke and Ryan Hart about the murder of their mother and sister. They made the deliberate choice to omit their father's name from the story and focus entirely on celebrating the victims' lives.
That choice directly challenges the sensationalist default. It shows that these perpetrators are often mundane humans, not fantastical monsters, and it gives real insight into the mechanics of coercive control.
And true crime has also been a huge tool for advocating for criminalized survivors, people who are in prison for fighting back against their abusers.
The case of Nikki Adamando is a great example. She was convicted after years of severe domestic abuse, and a podcast about her case brought so much attention that it significantly contributed to her early release. The media forced a second look at her case through the lens of trauma and survival.
And just on a broader level, these narratives are so essential for exposing systemic issues that the traditional news cycle often misses.
Absolutely. They highlight wrongful convictions, prosecutorial misconduct, and institutional biases. The NCVC specifically noted the lack of mainstream reporting on victims of color, which makes dedicated true crime content an essential tool for balanced advocacy.
So when it's done right, when it's accurate, ethical, and victim-centered, it can really bridge that gap between public awareness and real, actionable reform.
It's probably the most effective tool we have right now for sustaining public attention on systemic failure. The challenge is formalizing these positive examples into a real, enforceable standard for the whole industry.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. Based on all the research, what would a definitive standard for ethical content look like? What are the core criteria that every piece of true crime media should meet?
Okay, drawing from the analysis and the NCVC guidelines, ethical content has to be, first, well-researched, facts are triple-checked, assumptions are flagged. Second, it has to be clear and accurate.
Third, it has to be humanizing, focusing on the victims' lives, not just their final moments.
Fourth, non-sensationalist, avoiding graphic details just for shock value. Fifth, it cannot glorify the perpetrator. And finally, it has to be socially aware, using the story to highlight systemic issues, not just individual horror.
That feels like the absolute minimum standard. The CEO of the National Center for Victims of Crime argues that creators who are providing true crime stories as entertainment should not view their ethical obligations as somehow less than what journalists are held to.
I'd argue their obligation is even greater. Because of the massive impact and reach of these podcasts and docuseries and the lack of traditional editors, they have to impose that ethical rigor on themselves.
That's a great point. And the NCVC has provided these really concrete, trauma-informed steps for how to engage with victims and families. These aren't just suggestions. They're best practices for reducing harm.
Let's run through them, because this is the practical advice that separates the ethical creators from the exploiters. It starts with the absolute bedrock principle, consent.
Always seek permission to cover a story. And this applies even if the victim is deceased. They have families, friends, entire communities who will be affected by the coverage. Trauma doesn't have a timeline.
And when you're telling the story, you have to actively avoid re-traumatization in the production itself. What does that mean practically?
It means absolutely no old graphic pictures or videos. It means never, ever reenacting murder scenes or a victim's final painful moments. A creator needs to ask themselves, would I be okay with this graphic photo of my own family member being shared publicly? If the answer is no, then don't publish it.
And the interview process itself requires immense empathy.
You should provide victims with questions ahead of time so they can prepare. You have to respect their requests to avoid certain topics, and crucially, give them a real heads up before the story airs. It helps them prepare mentally for the public scrutiny.
And we talked about the harassment problem earlier. Creators have to respect boundaries in their communication, too.
The rule is simple. If you contact a victim and they say no, you take no for an answer immediately. You don't hound them with calls and messages until they feel like they have to delete their social media accounts.
And finally, the whole thing needs to be framed correctly, centering the victim, not the perpetrator.
The focus has to be on the victim's life, their achievements, their story, not just the gruesome details or the tedious psychology of the killer.
Which shifts the responsibility back to the listener, to you. If we understand what ethical content looks like, we have a real role to play in demanding it.
We do. Consumers need to practice critical media consumption. You have to ask yourself, why am I watching this? Who is affected by my consumption, by my financial support of this media? Am I really learning about systemic issues, or am I just consuming suffering without empathy?
If the audience, especially the huge demographic of women who drive this genre, shifts their attention and their money away from content that glorifies killers and towards content that genuinely supports victims, the industry will have no choice but to evolve.
The ultimate goal for any true crime fan should be to educate yourself on the facts and the narratives of the victimized. If there's no empathy or resulting action, it's just consuming suffering for entertainment.
So we've established that the true crime genre today holds this immense, almost unbelievable power. It can expose injustice and help survivors find their voice, but it can also exploit, re-traumatize, and generate massive profits from pain.
So what does this all mean? It means the critical choice now rests with both the creators, who have to adopt these trauma-informed standards, and with us, the consumers, who have to demand and support morally sound content.
Which brings me to a final thought. If the victim's suffering is what fuels the entire true crime industry, what would happen if all of us, all consumers, redirected our attention, our clicks, our spending power exclusively toward content that was certified victim-centered and focused only on advocacy and systemic reform?
If true crime is here to stay, and it seems like it is,
How can we leverage its massive popularity solely to fix the broken systems it currently profits from? That's the challenge for everyone listening. To make your consumption a tool for justice, not just a source of entertainment.
we really encourage you to explore resources from places like the National Center for Victims of Crime. Becoming a trauma-informed consumer is the first, and maybe the most critical, step toward creating a truly ethical genre.